My mother-in-law took the microphone out of the county fair chairman's hand before he'd finished reading the runner-up placings, pressed it to her chest the way she does when she wants a room to notice her hands are shaking with emotion, and told 300 people at the Harvest Honey Awards banquet that she was the one who'd taught me beekeeping in her backyard when I was 19 years old. My name is Ingrid. My husband is Callum. My mother-in-law is Rosalind, and in the 10 years I've known her, I have never once seen her stand within arm's reach of an open hive without flinching at the sound of a single bee. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and I promise it comes back around before the night is over. I own Goldenrod Apiary, 40 hives spread across 3 rented orchards and a production shed I converted from a horse barn, and until 8 months ago I sold honey and mead out of a folding table at the Saturday market and shipped the rest from a cooler on my porch. The man who actually taught me beekeeping was Walt Kessler, who ran Kessler's apiary supply out of a cinder block building behind the feed store for 42 years and apprenticed exactly 6 people in that time, because he said anyone who wanted to learn faster than that wasn't learning it right. I was the 6th. I started at 19, sweeping his workroom floor and bottling honey in exchange for one Saturday morning a month at his hives, and it took him 3 years before he'd let me open a box without him standing behind my shoulder. This past spring I finally had enough saved to build the thing I'd been planning since I was still working out of that cooler, a real tasting room and mead hall attached to the production shed, somewhere people could sit down, taste a flight of varietal honeys, and buy a bottle of the mead I'd been quietly perfecting in Walt's back room for 6 years before I ever sold a drop of it. The Harvest Honey Awards, run by the County Beekeeping Association Walt had belonged to since before I was born, happened to fall the same week as my grand opening, and this year I'd entered a wildflower varietal that took first place. Local press was there to cover both. Walt was there, 81 years old and using a cane now after a knee replacement, sitting at the association's table in the same canvas coat he'd worn to every fair I could remember. The claim didn't start tonight. It started close to 2 years ago, at a smaller open house I threw when I first got my beekeeping certification renewed, when Rosalind told one of my new customers, a retired schoolteacher named Phyllis who'd stopped by for a jar of clover honey, that she'd gotten Ingrid started on bees back when I was too shy to talk to anyone about it. Phyllis mentioned it to me afterward, warmly, assuming it was true and that I'd just never brought it up. I laughed it off. Rosalind had never once mentioned owning a beehive in the 10 years I'd known her. It kept happening in small doses after that. At Callum's birthday dinner, she told his cousins she'd planted the idea in my head one summer at her old house. At her book club, she told the group she used to keep a couple of boxes in her yard and that she'd shown me how before I ever met that man at the feed store, which is how she always referred to Walt, never by name. Callum rolled his eyes every time and told me to let it go, that this was just his mother wanting a piece of something she found impressive. I mostly let it go, because arguing with Rosalind about anything cost more than it was worth, and because for a long time it only reached people who had no reason to check. That changed about 5 months ago, when Rosalind started showing up to my monthly beginner workshops uninvited, standing near the back with a scarf wrapped around her face like a veil, and correcting my students' smoker technique in a voice loud enough for the whole group to hear. "Not so much smoke, dear, that's not how I taught Ingrid." My students didn't know what to make of it. 2 of them later asked my workshop assistant, a college kid named Marcus, if Rosalind used to run the apiary. Marcus told me about it that same afternoon, clearly uncomfortable, and asked if he should say something to her directly. I told him not yet. I still thought this was vanity, not something that could actually cost me anything, and I didn't want a fight with my husband's mother over a story that felt, at the time, more embarrassing than dangerous. The turn happened when Rosalind gave an interview. The regional lifestyle magazine, Willow Valley Living, was doing a feature on my grand opening ahead of the ribbon cutting, and the writer, a friendly enough woman named Teresa who'd clearly never covered anything more contentious than a farmer's market, asked around for color anyone with a personal angle on how I got my start. Somebody, I still don't know who, gave her Rosalind's number. She told Teresa, on the record, that she'd introduced me to beekeeping as a teenager in her own backyard, that she'd always known I had a gift for it, and that watching goldenrod grow into a real tasting room felt like watching her own patience with me finally pay off. Teresa printed it almost verbatim, 3 paragraphs in, under a photo of my new hall's front porch. She never called me to check the claim, because it wasn't presented as a claim, it was presented as a proud mother-in-law's quote, harmless color for a feel-good piece. Walt saw it first. He called me at 6:30 in the morning, and I could hear in his voice that he was trying to keep it light and not quite managing it. Ingrid, who in the hell is Rosalind, and why does Willow Valley Living think she taught you to read a brood pattern? I read him the paragraph over the phone. He was quiet for a second and then he laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. Walt had trained me for 3 years, and paid Saturday mornings on his end more often than either of us ever mentioned out loud, and now a woman he'd never met was in print taking that from him. In the same season his own name was going up on a plaque inside my new tasting room as the association's founding Mentor of the Year. I called Rosalind. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why she told a magazine writer she taught me beekeeping when she knew that wasn't true. She didn't apologize. She said she'd always felt connected to my hive somehow, that she used to drive me to 4-H meetings as a teenager, which had happened exactly twice, both organized by my own mother, not her, and that she didn't see what the big deal was if it made a nicer story for the magazine. Callum tried to talk to her too, and got a version of the same non-answer, plus a comment about how I was too sensitive about who gets credit for what for someone who owned a whole apiary now. I decided, that week, that I wasn't going to let this die down quietly the way it had every other time. Not because of my own ego about it. I genuinely don't need public credit for my own hands, calloused as they are, but because Walt had spent 4 decades teaching people for free out of a cinder block shed with a busted swamp cooler, and I was not going to stand in a tasting room he'd helped make possible and let his one clean legacy line get quietly handed to somebody who flinched at the sound of a single bee. So I went looking for the one thing that would settle it without a shouting match, the hive inspection ledger Walt had kept on me from my very first Saturday, the leather-bound one he still stored on a shelf behind his register, the one with my name on the spine in his own block handwriting, dated the June I turned 19, 3 years of dated entries and his initials next to every hive I'd been cleared to open on my own. I found it exactly where it had always been. Walt let me photograph every page and had the cover reinforced at the print shop, half as a joke and half because he said if we were doing this, we were doing it properly. Tonight, Rosalind waited until the awards had been read and the chairman had opened the floor for a few short remarks, mine for the wildflower ribbon, Walt's as outgoing board secretary, one of the judges, and then, while I was still walking back from the podium, she reached over, took the microphone out of the chairman's hand before he'd fully let go of it, and told the room she wanted to say a few words as the woman who started all this. She said she'd taught me beekeeping in her backyard before I ever set foot in Walt's shop, that watching this apiary grow into a real business felt like watching her own patients finally get recognized, and that she hoped everyone would remember, when they tasted the honey on their tables tonight, whose hands had first shown mine what to do. The room did the polite thing a room full of strangers does when a stranger's older relative says something sentimental at a podium. A soft round of applause, a few awas, someone's phone lifted to film it. My staff, who knew better, went very still. Marcus looked at me. Walt looked at the floor. I walked back up to the podium and asked the chairman, quietly, if I could add one more thing. He handed me the mic without hesitation, since he had no idea anything was wrong. I told the room that I loved my mother-in-law, and that I understood why a story like the one she'd just told was a nice one to want to be part of. Then I said that Goldenrod Apiary's teaching program exists because Walt Kessler, sitting right there in the same canvas coat he'd worn to every fair for 40 years, has never once trusted memory over a ledger. I held up the reinforced logbook, angled it so the closest phone cameras could actually read it, and read the cover out loud. Hive inspections, my name in Walt's own block handwriting, 3 years of dated entries, his initials next to every single hive he'd cleared me to open alone, starting the June I was 19. I said that as far as that ledger was concerned, and as far as 4 decades of Walt's own record keeping was concerned, there had only ever been one teacher in this county who'd put in the Saturday mornings, and he'd been sitting at that table the entire night wondering if anyone was going to say his name out loud. Then I asked Walt to stand, and the applause this time wasn't polite. It went on long enough that the chairman had to gesture for the association's photographer to actually get it on camera for the newsletter. Rosalind didn't storm out. She's not a storm-out kind of woman. She prefers to leave a room believing she's the only one who noticed she was leaving. She set her wine glass down on the nearest table, told a cluster of Callum's cousins that the room had turned ugly over nothing, and left through the side door near the coat check 20 minutes before the banquet actually ended. Callum found her in the parking lot and they had a conversation I wasn't part of and don't need to be. He told me afterward, in the car, that he'd finally said out loud what he should have said 18 months ago, that she doesn't get to keep doing this, and that the next time she tries to rewrite what happened in front of people who matter to us, he's not going to soften it for her afterward the way he has every other time. Teresa from Willow Valley Living ran a short correction online 2 days later, quoting Walt directly this time, along with a photo of the ledger page. Rosalind hasn't mentioned the backyard hives since. She still comes to family dinners, and Callum and I have decided we're not going to make a production out of freezing her out, because that's its own kind of exhausting, and because I'd rather spend that energy running an apiary than managing a feud. But Walt keeps a photocopy of that ledger page taped up behind his register now, right next to the original, and every new person who asks about it gets the same answer from him. Paperwork remembers what people would rather forget, so keep yours. The tasting room is booked through the fall harvest. Marcus, the college kid who started all this by accident, finished his season as my assistant, then asked to apprentice properly, and last month he opened his first hive alone under Walt's supervision, block handwriting already reaching for the ledger before the lid had even come off.